My cousin turned family gatherings into a courtroom for my 6-year-old son, blaming him for every mess her own boy made. So I waited, filmed everything, and burned her perfect reputation to the ground. Grandma's garden was destroyed by the time I got outside. Tomato stakes snapped in half. Marigolds flattened into the dirt. My 6-year-old son, Eli, stood frozen at the edge of the patio, a paper plate of untouched turkey still balanced in his hands. Vanessa was already screaming his name. Eli Robert Callahan, you get over here right now? I set my drink down on the porch railing. My hands went cold before my brain caught up with what was happening. He didn't do anything, I said. He's been standing with me the whole time. Vanessa didn't even look at me. She grabbed Eli by both shoulders and spun him toward the wrecked flower bed like she was presenting evidence in a trial. Look what you did. Look at Grandma's garden. Eli's chin started to shake. He hadn't moved from that spot in 10 minutes. I knew it. 3 other adults on the patio had watched him standing there the entire time, plate in hand, watching Grayson chase a lizard through the tomato stakes with a stick. He was inside, Grayson said quickly, not even looking up from his own shoes. He told me to do it. Vanessa's face did something I'd seen 100 times by then, a kind of righteous collapse, like the accusation physically hurt her to speak. Eli, apologize to your great-grandmother. Right now. My son looked at me, not at her, at me, waiting for me to fix it. Vanessa, I said, keeping my voice level because I'd learned that raising it only made me look unstable in front of the family. He was standing right here with a full plate of food. He didn't touch the garden. So now you're calling Grayson a liar, she said, in front of everyone. Grandma came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, already looking at Eli like he'd confirmed something she'd suspected all year. Eli, sweetheart, is this true? My son started crying into his paper plate, right there in front of 14 relatives at his own family's Thanksgiving dinner for something he never did. That was the day I decided I was done being reasonable about this. Eli was 6. He'd been born in March, 7 years after I married his father, and by the time this happened, I'd been divorced for 2 of those years, raising him mostly on my own in a rented townhouse in Marietta, Georgia, 20 minutes from where the rest of the family still gathered every holiday at my grandmother's house on Ashwood Lane. My cousin Vanessa was 34, 5 years older than me, and she had built her entire identity around being the responsible one in the family. The one with the stable marriage, the one with the son who played travel soccer and made honor roll, the one everyone called when they needed advice about anything from mortgages to marriage counseling. Her son Grayson was 7, 11 months older than Eli, and from the time the 2 of them were toddlers, there had been a current running underneath their relationship that I hadn't wanted to name out loud. Grayson broke things. Grayson took things that weren't his. Grayson lied smoothly, without hesitation, the way some kids do when they've learned that a confident lie usually beats a nervous truth, and every single time, Vanessa found a way to make it Eli's fault. It started small enough that I told myself I was imagining it. When the boys were 4 and 5, Grayson knocked a glass bowl of my aunt's potpourri off an end table, and Vanessa said Eli had been roughhousing near it, even though the boys were in separate rooms at the time. I let it go. It was a bowl of potpourri. It wasn't worth a fight at a family gathering. Then, the summer Eli turned 5, Grayson smashed the ceramic vase Grandma kept on her mantle, a piece that had belonged to her own mother, by throwing a tennis ball at it inside the living room. I was in the backyard with Eli at the time, both of us up to our knees in a kiddie pool, in full view of my uncle who was grilling 10 feet away. Vanessa told the room that Eli had done it. When I pointed out that Eli hadn't been inside the house in over an hour, she said, calm as anything, that maybe I hadn't been watching him as closely as I thought. I brought it up to her privately in the kitchen that day. I said, Vanessa, he was outside with me. You know that. She looked at me with an expression I would come to recognize as her signature move, a kind of wounded patience, like I was the one being difficult. I just think it's interesting how defensive you get whenever Grayson brings something up. That was the pattern. Not just blaming Eli, but reframing any pushback from me as evidence of my own guilt or denial. If I defended my son, I was being defensive. If I stayed calm, I was hiding something. If I got upset, I was proving I couldn't handle criticism. I remember driving home that night, turning the whole exchange over in my head, trying to figure out at what point a normal conversation with my cousin had turned into something I needed to brace for before I even walked in the door, and not landing on an answer because there hadn't been a single moment. It had happened slowly enough that I'd adjusted to each new version of her without ever quite noticing the sum of it. The incident that should have told me everything happened at my cousin Paige's engagement party, 8 months before that Thanksgiving. Grayson ate an entire plate of chocolate-covered strawberries that had been set aside for the dessert table and made himself sick in the bathroom. Eli was severely allergic to chocolate. He couldn't have eaten one of those strawberries without breaking out in hives within minutes, something the entire family knew because I'd been carrying an EpiPen in my purse since he was 2. Vanessa still told my aunt that Eli had dared Grayson to eat them all in a contest. My aunt believed her. Nobody stopped to ask how a 6-year-old with a life-threatening chocolate allergy would have dared another kid to eat chocolate, or why Eli would have been anywhere near a dessert table stocked with something that could put him in the emergency room. I didn't fight that one very hard either. I was tired. I told myself these were small things, silly disputes over vases and strawberries, not worth burning down a family relationship over. What I didn't understand yet was that Vanessa wasn't reacting to isolated incidents. She was building a narrative, one small story at a time, and every story had the same shape. Grayson makes a mess. mess. Eli gets blamed. The family nods along because Vanessa says it with such total confidence that doubting her feels like doubting gravity. Vanessa and I hadn't always been like this. Growing up, she was the closest thing I had to an older sister, since I was an only child until my parents adopted my sister Renee when I was 9. Vanessa used to drive me to my SAT prep classes the summer I turned 16, because my own mother worked nights at a hospital in Roswell and couldn't take me herself. She stood up in my wedding at 26, wore a dress the color of sage green that she still had photos of framed in her hallway. When I called her from a hospital waiting room the night Eli was born, 3 weeks early and 2 centimeters short of an emergency C-section, she drove 40 minutes at 11 at night and sat with me through 12 hours of labor while my then husband was still somewhere over Ohio on a delayed flight home from a work trip. I have never forgotten that. Some part of me spent the next 6 years of her cruelty toward my son, unwilling to fully believe the woman who held my hand that night was capable of what I was watching her do. That's part of why it took so long. It wasn't just that I didn't want to be the difficult cousin at family gatherings. It was that admitting what Vanessa had become would have meant admitting that the person I trusted most outside my own household had quietly turned into someone else, and I wasn't ready to grieve that while I was still hoping I'd misjudged the pattern. By the time Eli turned 6, I'd started keeping a mental list. Not because I was plotting anything yet, I was just trying to hold on to the truth in a family that seemed increasingly willing to let Vanessa rewrite it in real time. The garden incident at Thanksgiving broke something in me that the earlier ones hadn't. Maybe it was watching my son cry into a paper plate in front of the whole family. Maybe it was Grandma's face when she looked at him like he'd confirmed something. Whatever it was, I drove home that night with Eli asleep in his booster seat, and somewhere on I-75, I stopped being someone who let things go. I didn't say anything to Vanessa about it that week. I didn't confront her, didn't post about it, didn't even bring it up to my sister right away. Instead, I bought 2 small wireless cameras from an electronics store off Hobb Parkway, the kind that looked like smoke detectors, and I started bringing one with me to every family gathering after that, tucked into a diaper bag I still carried out of habit even though Eli hadn't worn a diaper in 3 years. The first gathering after Thanksgiving was Grandma's birthday in January, a small dinner at her house with maybe 8 people. I set the camera on a bookshelf in the den, angled toward the coffee table where the kids usually played. Nothing dramatic happened that night. Grayson knocked over a cup of juice and blamed it on the dog, which didn't even exist anymore. Grandma's dog had passed away 2 years earlier. Nobody but me seemed to notice the strangeness of that lie. I kept the footage anyway. I was learning his patterns. He lied fast, without thinking, the way you do when lying has never actually cost you anything. In February, at my uncle's Super Bowl party, I caught something more useful. Grayson went through 3 separate purses left on the guest bed, including my aunt's, and pocketed a folded $20 bill from one of them. He didn't know the camera was there, tucked between 2 decorative pillows. He counted the money in his hand, looked around the empty room, and slid it into his sock. My aunt spent 20 minutes later that night insisting she must have miscounted her cash before her hair appointment. I said nothing. I filed the footage away on an external hard drive I kept in a locked filing cabinet in my bedroom closet next to Eli's old baby books. In March, Vanessa hosted Easter at her own house, a big colonial in a subdivision off Barrett Parkway. The kind of house with a 2-story foyer and a chandelier she was always mentioning had come from an estate sale in Buckhead. Grayson broke a lamp in the formal living room while wrestling a cousin's dog that had been let inside despite Vanessa's rule about no pets past the foyer. He told his mother Eli had let the dog in. Eli had been at the kitchen table with me the entire time, eating a slice of ham in full view of 4 other adults. This time, I didn't stay quiet. I said evenly, "Vanessa, Eli's been sitting right here." She didn't yell. She rarely yelled. That wasn't her style. Instead, she got that soft, aggrieved look, the one that made other people in the room feel protective of her. "I just find it interesting," she said, "that every single time something happens, you have an alibi ready. An alibi. Like I was defending a suspect instead of stating where my son had physically been sitting for the last hour. 4 other adults saw him at that table," I said. "This isn't an alibi, it's just where he was." "You always do this," Vanessa said, her voice dropping into something quieter, more wounded, more effective in a room full of relatives who wanted to believe the best about her. "You turn every little thing into a whole production. Grayson made an honest mistake letting a dog in. Can we not make it a courtroom?" The word landed strangely, considering what I would eventually call this whole ordeal in my own head, a courtroom. She'd used the word before I ever thought to use it myself, as though some part of her already understood exactly what these gatherings had become for my son, and had simply decided to keep presiding over them anyway. I didn't push further that day. My uncle's wife touched my arm gently and suggested we get dessert going, the universal signal in our family for time to let a disagreement die before it ruined the meal, and I let it die, the way I always did, because I still believed at that point that being the reasonable one would eventually be enough. There was a smaller incident that spring, one I almost forgot to count because nothing broke and nobody cried, but it told me more about Vanessa than any of the dramatic ones. We were at a birthday party for my aunt's neighbor's daughter, a gathering with kids from 3 or 4 different families, and Grayson got into an argument with a boy he didn't know over a video game controller. He shoved the boy hard enough to knock him into a bookshelf. The boy's mother, a woman none of us knew well, saw the whole thing happen with her own eyes. Vanessa apologized to her immediately, calmly, took full responsibility, told Grayson to sit in in timeout for the rest of the party. No blaming, no deflection, no mention of Eli at all, because Eli wasn't even there that day. I drove home thinking about that for a long time. It wasn't that Vanessa was incapable of holding Grayson accountable. She'd done it cleanly, in front of a stranger, without hesitation. The difference was that a stranger's judgment didn't threaten her identity the way our family's judgment did. In front of people who didn't know her, who had no stake in the story of who she was, she could just be a normal mother handling a normal kid problem. It was only inside our family, where her image as the capable one, the together one, the one everyone measured themselves against, was actually at stake, that the truth became negotiable. That told me this wasn't confusion or blind motherly love clouding her judgment. It was strategic. She knew exactly what she was doing. She simply reserved it for an audience that mattered to her. That was when I started to understand the shape of what she was doing. It wasn't really about the vase, or the lamp, or the $20 bill. It was about maintaining a story in which her son was fundamentally good and mine was fundamentally suspect, and any evidence that contradicted that story got absorbed and repurposed as proof of my own denial. The family had watched her manage a difficult divorce with Grace 2 years earlier, watched her hold the whole extended family together after my grandfather's death, watched her organize every holiday gathering with warmth and competence. Nobody wanted to believe that same woman was capable of scapegoating a 6-year-old for sport. It was easier to believe I was overprotective, or in denial, or quietly resentful of how well her family was doing compared to mine. I planted my first real test in April. At a cousin's baby shower, I mentioned, casually to my aunt, that some cash had gone missing from my wallet after the last gathering, and wondered aloud whether maybe some kids just had sticky fingers. I didn't name anyone. I didn't have to. Vanessa found me in the kitchen 20 minutes later, practically vibrating. "Are you seriously implying Grayson stole from you?" "I didn't say his name," I said. "You didn't have to. Everyone knows what you meant." Her voice cracked, just slightly, right on cue. "I can't believe after everything you'd accuse my son of being a thief." I let her search Eli's backpack in front of 3 other women, right there in my aunt's kitchen, because I already knew what she'd find. Nothing. And she did find nothing. And the search itself did what I needed it to do. It planted a seed. A few of the women exchanged a look I hadn't seen before. A flicker of doubt aimed for the first time in Vanessa's direction, instead of mine. Vanessa didn't apologize for the search. She never apologized for anything. By that point, I had a habit of reviewing the footage late at night after Eli was asleep, sitting cross-legged on my bed with headphones in, watching the same 11 seconds of Grayson lying to a room full of adults over and over, trying to understand what I was looking at. It never got easier to watch. Somewhere in there, I started noticing something I hadn't clocked in the moment because I'd been too focused on my own son's face. Grayson watched his mother while he lied, not the adults he was lying to, her. A quick flick of the eyes toward Vanessa, checking, calibrating, before he committed to whatever version of events he was about to tell. She never gave him an obvious signal that I could see. She didn't need to. He already knew what she wanted the story to be, and he built it to match. The way a kid learns which answer gets him a hug instead of a lecture. At a graduation party for a family friend's daughter that May, Grayson tore a page out of a signed guest book that had been circulating for the graduate, doodled on the back of it, and dropped it behind a couch cushion when an adult walked into the room. Eli was 2 rooms away at the time, at the dessert table with my sister, a fact confirmed by 6 witnesses, including the graduate's own mother. Vanessa still managed to work Eli's name into the conversation that followed, telling my aunt within earshot of several people that the boys must have been messing with the guest book together, careful never to say his name directly enough to be corrected, vague enough to plant the idea without giving anyone a clean fact to dispute. I was learning this was one of her favorite techniques, not a direct accusation every time, sometimes just a soft, deniable insinuation, dropped into a conversation and left to do its work on its own. Something had shifted after the backpack search, though, and she seemed to feel it too, because at the next gathering, a Memorial Day cookout at my uncle's, she was sweeter to me than she'd been in over a year, complimenting my job, asking about my dating life, telling everyone how proud she was of how I was raising Eli on my own. It wasn't kindness, it was damage control. She could feel the ground moving under her, even if she couldn't name why. I kept filming. By June, I had 11 months of footage. Grayson breaking a patio umbrella and blaming a gust of wind that hadn't happened. Grayson telling a cousin's 5-year-old that Santa wasn't real, then blaming Eli when the younger kid cried. Grayson, in a moment that still turns my stomach, telling another child at a playground gathering that, "Next time I'll just say Eli did it, nobody checks anyway," a sentence caught clearly on the camera I'd left running in a stroller parked 6 feet away. That sentence was the one I knew, eventually, I would need. In July, at a 4th of July gathering at Grandma's, the ceiling I thought couldn't get any higher rose again anyway. Grayson lit a bottle rocket in the driveway, despite being told twice not to touch the fireworks box, and it went sideways into the open garage, scorching a black streak up the side of my uncle's fishing boat and setting a stack of cardboard recycling on fire. Someone doused it with a garden hose within seconds. No real damage beyond the boat's paint and a ruined tarp, but it was close enough to serious that 3 different adults came running. Vanessa got to the garage before I did. By the time I arrived, she already had a story assembled, telling my uncle that she'd seen Eli near the fireworks box right before it happened, a sentence constructed with just enough hedging, right before, near, that she could later claim she never technically said he lit it. Eli was inside the house at that exact moment, at the kitchen table with Grandma, cutting star shapes out of construction paper for a craft project she'd set up for the younger kids. Grandma herself confirmed it immediately without hesitation because she'd been sitting across from him. It was the first time I watched someone else shut Vanessa's story down before I even had to open my mouth, and I remember the tiny, cold satisfaction of watching Vanessa recalibrate in real time, backpedaling into a vaguer version of the same insinuation that she must have seen someone who looked like him, a claim just as unfalsifiable as the last one had been convenient. I didn't say much that day. I didn't need to. I just added the footage from the porch camera, which had caught Grayson himself reaching into the fireworks box twice before the rocket went off, to the growing file on the external hard drive in my closet, now well past 10 months of footage, and I drove home that night thinking that whatever came next was going to have to be big enough that nobody in that family could talk their way around it afterward. The real strike came in September, at Cousin Paige's wedding. Paige had asked Vanessa to be her maid of honor, and Vanessa had spent months talking about the reception at every gathering leading up to it. The venue in Roswell, the $3,000 cake from a bakery downtown that Paige's mother-in-law had specifically requested, the string quartet, the whole production. Vanessa loved being at the center of an event like that. She loved being the one everyone looked to for how things should be done. I brought both cameras that day, one clipped inside my purse, angled toward the reception hall entrance. One I asked the wedding videographer, a woman named Renata, who I'd befriended over the summer at a mutual friend's engagement shoot, if I could quietly borrow for 20 minutes during the cocktail hour, telling her I wanted a candid angle of the kids for a scrapbook. She said sure, set it on a side table near the cake, and went to grab another lens from her car. During the 20 minutes when the wedding party stepped outside for formal photos, I gave Grayson what I called a secret mission. I told him quietly that it was his job to guard the cake while the grown-ups were busy, that it was a very important task and only a responsible kid could do it. He puffed up with pride. I already knew from 11 months of watching him exactly what would happen once he was alone in a room with something breakable and no adult in sight. He didn't just touch the cake. He climbed onto a chair to examine the top tier, lost his balance, and brought the entire three-tiered structure down onto the floor in a collapse that took out a corner of the linen tablecloth with it. Buttercream and cake debris covered 8 square feet of hardwood. He sat in the wreckage for a full minute, frosting up to his elbows, before he started crying. The wedding party came back in from photos to a disaster. Vanessa's scream carried across the entire reception hall. Eli, what did you do? Eli was standing in the photo line with the rest of the wedding party, in a small suit his father had bought him, 40 feet away, on camera in 11 different guest phones snapping pictures of the bridal party at that exact moment. Grayson sat in the middle of a ruined $3,000 cake with frosting on his hands, his face, and his rented dress shirt. Paige came around the corner in her wedding dress and just stopped, stared at the wreckage, stared at Vanessa's own son sitting in the middle of it. And Vanessa, without missing a beat, without even looking at the physical evidence in front of her, said it again, louder this time, so the whole room could hear. Eli did this. He must have dared him. That was the moment I stopped waiting. I walked to the side table, picked up the videographer's camera, and turned the small screen toward the room. I didn't say a word yet. I just pressed play, right there in front of 40 wedding guests, and let the last 20 minutes speak for themselves. Grayson climbing the chair. Grayson reaching for the top tier. Grayson alone in an empty room. No one within 50 feet of him, bringing the whole cake down himself. The room went quiet in a way I will never forget. Paige's new mother-in-law, the one who had specifically requested that cake, put both hands over her mouth. Paige turned to Vanessa with an expression I'd never seen her wear before. Not anger exactly, more like the specific horror of realizing someone you trusted had been lying to your face for years. You just accused a child who was standing 40 feet away, Paige said, on my wedding day in front of everyone, when your own son is sitting right there covered in frosting. Vanessa's face went through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, then denial, then something closer to panic. That footage doesn't show everything. There could have been. There's nobody else in the room, Vanessa, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. It's just Grayson. It's been just Grayson the whole time. I didn't stop there. I'd promised myself, somewhere around April, that if I ever showed this footage, I would show all of it, not just the cake. I connected the videographer's camera to the small portable projector I'd brought in my car, the one I told Renata I needed for a slideshow later in the reception, and I asked Paige quietly if I could have 5 minutes before the toasts. She said yes without hesitation. 11 months of footage played across a blank section of wall near the gift table, while Vanessa stood frozen by the ruined cake, still in her maid of honor dress, mascara starting to run under the string lights. Grayson pocketing the $20 bill from my aunt's purse. Grayson breaking the lamp while the dog wasn't even supposed to be inside. Grayson lighting the bottle rocket that scorched my uncle's boat. Grayson telling another child, flat out, on camera, next time I'll just say Eli did it, nobody checks anyway. And under almost every single clip, Vanessa's voice, calm and certain, blaming my son for something he never touched, in a tone I now recognized from a dozen other family gatherings, the same practiced patience she used every single time. Someone near the bar audibly gasped at the bottle rocket clip, the one that showed my uncle's boat catching a black scorch mark along its hull while Vanessa told him she'd seen Eli near the fireworks box. My uncle himself turned to look at his sister with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, somewhere between disbelief and something closer to grief. 40 guests stood in near total silence, some with plates of appetizers still in their hands, watching 11 months of a 6-year-old's life get corrected in real time on a rented wall. Nobody in that room said a word until it was over. Grandma was the first to speak. She'd made Eli write 2 separate apology letters over the past year, one to Vanessa and one to my aunt, for things I now had on video he never did. Her voice, when it finally came, was low and shaking in a way I'd never heard from her before. Vanessa, how long has this been happening? Vanessa's composure cracked for the first time since I'd known her. It's not, you're twisting this. Grayson is a good boy. Kids make mistakes, and I was just trying to. You made a 6-year-old cry into a paper plate at Thanksgiving, I said, in front of 14 people, for something he didn't do. Nobody defended her. Not my aunt, who had spent 20 minutes searching Eli's backpack for money her own son had stolen. Not Grandma, who had made my son write apology letters in his careful, 6-year-old handwriting for a garden he never touched. Not even Vanessa's own husband, who stood near the bar with an expression that told me this was the first time he was seeing most of this footage too. Grandma made Vanessa apologize to Eli directly, right there at the reception, in front of the family. It wasn't a real apology, not the kind that meant anything. More of a stiff, humiliated recitation through gritted teeth, delivered to a 6-year-old in a rented suit who didn't fully understand what was happening, except that his mother's hand was gripping his shoulder, and everyone was looking at him for once without accusation in their eyes. But it happened. And Grandma told her, in a voice that carried across the gift table, that she owed my aunt the $20 back, and that she and Paige's new in-laws would be discussing who was paying for that cake, and it wasn't going to be Paige. The band started up again about 10 minutes later, some upbeat song meant to pull the room back into celebration, and most of the guests drifted back toward the dance floor in the strange, disoriented way people move after witnessing something they weren't prepared for. A few came up to me quietly over the next hour, an older cousin I barely knew, one of Paige's co-workers, to say some version of the same thing, that they were sorry, that they hadn't known, that Vanessa had always seemed like someone who had it all figured out. I didn't know what to do with that kind of sympathy at the time. I just nodded and thanked them and kept an eye on Eli, who spent the rest of the reception glued to my leg, quieter than usual, sensing that something enormous had shifted in the room, even if he couldn't have named what. I thought that was the end of it. I genuinely believed, driving home that night with Eli asleep in the backseat again, still in his small rented suit, that I had finally won something. That the truth, once it was undeniable, would simply be accepted, and the family would recalibrate, and Vanessa would either change or quietly retreat from the spotlight she'd built her identity around. I was wrong about how it would end. I just didn't know that yet. 2 days after the wedding, on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner and Eli was doing his kindergarten homework at the kitchen table, my phone buzzed on the counter. Vanessa's name lit up the screen. Not a call, a text. I'm consulting a lawyer. What you did at Paige's wedding was defamation, and the emotional damage to Grayson is significant. You should have thought about that before you decided to humiliate a child in front of 40 people. I read it twice before the words fully landed. My hands started shaking, not from fear exactly, more from a kind of disbelief so total it felt physical. After everything. After a year of footage, after her own son sitting in a wrecked cake with frosting on his face, after Grandma making her apologize in front of the whole family, she was the one consulting a lawyer. She was making herself the victim again, and this time she was doing it with the legal system instead of a garden bed. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I called my sister before I even set the phone down. My voice cracked before she finished saying hello. She's threatening to sue me. Renee didn't ask a single clarifying question before she said, I'm coming over. By the time she arrived 20 minutes later, I was pacing a track into my kitchen linoleum while Eli played with his dinosaurs in his bedroom, blissfully unaware that his mother's evening had gone sideways. Renee sat me down at the kitchen table, made me a cup of tea I didn't drink, and we spent the next 2 hours going through every incident, every date, every piece of footage, writing it all out on a legal pad, because she said if this actually went anywhere, I needed a clean timeline. Truth isn't defamation, she kept saying over and over, like a mantra she was trying to plant in both our heads. You showed real footage of real things that really happened. That's not slander, that's evidence. I knew she was probably right. I also knew that being right and being able to afford a lawyer were two very different things. I called an attorney the next morning, a family friend's recommendation named Marcus Farrell, who worked out of a small office in Kennesaw above a dry cleaner. I sent him everything that same afternoon, the footage organized into 11 separate clips by date, the texts, a written timeline going back 14 months that Renee had helped me build on that legal pad, and then transferred into a spreadsheet with columns for date, location, incident, and witnesses present. It took me almost 3 hours to compile it all into a single shared folder, cross-referencing dates against old text messages and photos on my phone to make sure nothing was misremembered or out of order. Marcus called me back within the day. Legally, you're in a strong position, he said. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation in Georgia. If everything on that footage is accurate and you didn't fabricate or misrepresent it, she doesn't have a real case. Relief lasted about 4 seconds. That said, he continued, she can still file. People file weak cases all the time, hoping the other side folds before it gets to a judge. If she actually goes through with it, you're looking at retainer costs alone in the $5,000 to $10,000 range just to get through the initial phases, even if you win, $5,000 to $10,000. I did the math against my rent, against Eli's after-school program, against the used Honda I was still paying off, and felt something in my chest go very tight. All of that, to defend myself against a woman who had spent over a year telling an entire family my 6-year-old was some kind of budding delinquent. That night, after Eli's bath, he climbed into bed and asked me a question that split something open in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel yet. "Mommy, do I have to see Grayson again?" "Not until you're ready," I told him. "Not until you want to." He was quiet for a long moment, hugging the worn blue blanket he'd had since he was 2, the one with a satin edge he liked to rub between his fingers when he was thinking hard about something. "Do you think maybe I really am a bad kid?" he asked, since so many grown-ups thought so. I didn't cry in front of him. I made myself wait until I was back in the kitchen, dishes half done in the sink, before I sat down on the floor with my back against the cabinets and let it out. My 6-year-old son had spent over a year being told in a dozen different rooms by a dozen different adults that he was the kind of kid who broke things and blamed others, when the truth was the exact opposite the entire time. And now, even after the truth had come out, even after the footage, even after Grandma's apology demand, he was still asking me if maybe he deserved it. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the reception hall, Grayson's frosting-covered hands, Vanessa's face going pale and then furious when the room turned against her. I kept waiting for the part of me that felt triumphant to show up. It never did. Mostly I just felt tired and a little sick and afraid of what an envelope with a law firm's return address might actually contain. 3 days after her first text, it arrived. Certified mail. Signature required. I signed for it standing in my doorway in yesterday's t-shirt, Eli's cereal bowl still on the counter behind me, and carried it to the kitchen table like it might go off in my hands. 3 pages inside on letterhead from a firm I'd never heard of, out of an office building in Marietta I'd probably driven past 100 times without noticing. A formal demand, a public apology, issued to the extended family in writing, within 10 days. $15,000 to cover what the letter called Grayson's necessary therapeutic intervention, resulting from public humiliation and defamation of character. If I didn't comply, the firm would proceed with filing within the week. I stared at the number until the digits stopped meaning anything. $15,000. Over a truth I had video evidence of, from a family who had watched that evidence play across a wall at a wedding just 5 days earlier. My phone buzzed again while the letter was still shaking in my hand. A second message. A different number this time. No name attached, no context. I almost didn't open it. Part of me assumed it was Vanessa again, from a burner number, twisting the knife a little further before the lawsuit landed. But something about the timing made my stomach drop before I even unlocked the screen. And when I did, I understood immediately that whatever was on the other end of that message was about to change everything I thought I knew about how this whole year had actually happened. It was a message from Vanessa's husband, David. He'd never contacted me directly before, not once in the 15 years I'd known him. The message was 3 paragraphs long, and I read it standing in my kitchen with Eli's cereal bowl still in the sink, my coffee going cold on the counter. He told me he'd found the therapy invoices Vanessa was planning to submit as evidence of Grayson's emotional damage. They were dated from 8 months before the wedding. Grayson had been seeing a child psychologist since January, not because of anything that happened at Paige's reception, but because his kindergarten teacher had flagged concerning behavior patterns, lying, minor theft from classmates, difficulty accepting responsibility for his own actions. David said he'd been paying for those sessions quietly, out of a separate account, because Vanessa refused to acknowledge there was a problem with their son at all. She'd told the therapist in a session David had sat in on that Grayson's issues were the result of being unfairly scapegoated by a jealous cousin's child. David said he was done covering for her. He said he'd watched the footage from the wedding 3 times since Sunday, and something in him had finally broken loose. He'd been making excuses for both of them, Vanessa and Grayson, for almost 2 years, telling himself it would get better, telling himself Vanessa just had a hard time admitting her son wasn't perfect. He said the demand letter had been drafted before he even knew about it. Vanessa had contacted the lawyer without telling him, using money from an account he thought was for Grayson's college fund. He attached 3 screenshots, a therapy intake form from January, listing Grayson's presenting concerns in a clinician's clipped shorthand, difficulty with truthfulness, minor theft, poor accountability, age appropriate for intervention, a billing statement showing 11 sessions before the wedding ever happened, each one $140, paid from an account labeled only with the initials DM, and a message thread between Vanessa and her sister from the week before Thanksgiving, the very Thanksgiving with the garden, in which Vanessa wrote plainly, in text, that she was tired of everyone comparing Grayson unfavorably to Eli, and that she needed to, quote, find a way to even the playing field before people started asking questions about her parenting. Even the playing field. That was the phrase. Not a misunderstanding. Not a mother's blind spot toward her own child. A stated plan, in writing, to make my son look worse so that her son's real problems would stay hidden. I sat down at the kitchen table and read it 4 times. The detail that undid me wasn't even the plan itself. It was the date. She'd written that message 11 months before the wedding, which meant every single incident after that Thanksgiving, the $20 bill, the broken lamp, the missing cash at the baby shower, hadn't been random defensiveness from an overwhelmed mother. It had been a strategy. She had been managing a narrative in real time, using my 6-year-old son as the raw material while her own son's actual struggles went unaddressed because acknowledging them would have meant giving up the story she needed the family to believe about her family. I scrolled back through the screenshots again, checking the dates against my own timeline, the one Renee and I had built on a legal pad 2 nights earlier. The message about evening the playing field was sent on a Sunday night, 4 days before that Thanksgiving. The garden incident happened that Thursday. The intake form for Grayson's first therapy session was dated the following January, 6 weeks after that. I did the math over and over as though repeating it would soften what it meant. She hadn't panicked into that lie about the garden. She'd been sitting on a plan for days, waiting for the right moment. And when Grayson tore through Grandma's flower bed, she recognized her opening and used it without hesitation. I thought about the $20 bill Grayson had pocketed from my aunt's purse and how confidently Vanessa had defended him, so confidently that I'd doubted my own footage for a full day before I checked it twice to be sure of what I'd actually seen. I understood now that the confidence hadn't been conviction. It had been performance, rehearsed over months of protecting a narrative she'd chosen before any of these individual incidents even happened. The version of Vanessa I'd been quietly grieving, a once close cousin who'd simply lost her way under the pressure of a struggling kid, wasn't the version that had actually existed for the last year. The real version had made a decision, in writing, and then executed it patiently, one incident at a time, at the expense of a 6-year-old who trusted her. I called Marcus, my attorney, first thing the next morning, and forwarded him everything. He was quiet for a moment after reading it. "This changes things significantly," he said. "If she's filing a defamation suit based on damages that predate the alleged defamation, and there's a documented statement of intent to scapegoat your son for optics, that's not just a weak case anymore. That's something a judge is going to have real questions about." He drafted a response letter that afternoon. Not an apology, not a settlement offer, a formal notice that if Vanessa proceeded with her claim, we would be entering the therapy records, the billing statements, and the text message thread into evidence, along with 14 months of video footage already shown to a room of 40 witnesses at a public event. I didn't send it myself. Marcus sent it through his firm, certified, same as hers had come. Word moved through the extended family faster than I expected, mostly through a group text thread of 9 cousins that had existed for years, and that I mostly muted because it was usually just birthday reminders and holiday planning. Someone, I never found out who, posted a single line into that thread 2 days after David's message went around. "Does anyone else know about the therapy stuff?" Within an hour, it had turned into 40 messages I had to scroll through the next morning with my coffee going cold. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in over a year weighing in, some defending Vanessa reflexively out of old loyalty, most of them slowly coming around once someone posted a screenshot of the evening the playing field message with names blacked out. My cousin Marcus, no relation to my attorney, a guy I'd maybe spoken to 4 times at holidays in a decade, sent me a private message afterward just to say he was sorry, that he remembered Eli getting blamed for something at a barbecue 2 years back and hadn't thought much of it at the time, and that he felt sick realizing now it had probably been part of the same pattern the whole time. 3 days passed in silence. Then Grandma called me, her voice tight in a way I'd rarely heard from her. "Vanessa came by yesterday," she said. "She wanted me to talk you out of whatever you're planning to do." I told her I already knew about the therapy sessions. David called me on Sunday night. It turned out David hadn't only reached out to me. He'd called Grandma too, and my aunt and Paige, laying out the same information across the family in the days after the wedding, no longer willing to be the quiet enabler in a story he'd apparently been uneasy about for a long time. Grandma told me Vanessa had shown up at her house crying, insisting the message to her sister had been taken out of context, that evening the playing field could have meant anything, that David was exaggerating out of some kind of midlife crisis or resentment toward her. I asked her outright, Grandma said. I said, "Vanessa, did you write those words?" She couldn't say no. She just kept saying I was twisting it. The confrontation I'd been bracing for didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened 2 weeks later, at a small gathering at my aunt's house that I almost didn't attend, uncertain whether the family had actually absorbed what David had shared or whether Vanessa had managed to talk her way back into the center of the story again. Eli stayed home with my sister that day. I wasn't ready to bring him back into a room with any of them yet, not until I understood which way the family was going to land. Vanessa was there when I arrived, sitting stiffly on the edge of the couch, and the room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone already knows what's coming. "I want to say something," I told her, standing near the doorway, not sitting down, because I didn't want this to feel comfortable for either of us. "For over a year, you used my 6-year-old son to hide the fact that your own son needed help. You knew he was struggling. You had him in therapy. And instead of dealing with that, you decided it was easier to make Eli the villain in a story you were telling this entire family." Vanessa's chin lifted, that same wounded posture she'd used a dozen times before, the one that usually made a room soften toward her. It didn't work this time. I watched it not work, watched my aunt's face stay flat, watched Grandma's arms stay crossed. "You have no idea what it's like," Vanessa said. "Raising a kid people are already deciding to give up on. I was trying to protect him. Then why didn't you tell me he was struggling? I would have helped. I would have understood Vanessa better than almost anyone in that room, because I've spent 6 years defending my own son against exactly the kind of judgment you're describing." She didn't have an answer for that either, not right away. When she finally spoke, spoke, her voice had lost most of its practiced softness, because admitting it meant admitting I couldn't fix it. And you were always so put together, even doing it alone. And I couldn't stand the idea of you seeing that I wasn't. It was the closest thing to an honest sentence I'd heard from her in over a year. And it still didn't excuse a single thing she'd done, but it was the first time I understood the shape of what had been driving her instead of just the damage it had caused. You were protecting your image, I said. There's a difference. Protecting him would have meant getting him help without needing my son to be a scapegoat for it. You had both. You chose the scapegoat because it was easier than sitting with the fact that your kid wasn't perfect. She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time since I'd known her, Vanessa didn't have a smooth, wounded reply, ready to reframe the moment back in her favor. She just sat there, and something in her face finally cracked into something that looked less like performance and more like the exhaustion of someone who'd been holding up a story for too long to remember what was underneath it. I need you to say it, I told her. Not to me, to Eli someday, when he's old enough to understand it, that none of it was true, that he never did any of those things. I'm not asking for it today, but someday you owe him that. My aunt spoke up then, from the armchair by the window, her voice quieter than I expected. I owe you an apology too, Vanessa. I searched a 6-year-old's backpack because you asked me to look him in the eye and accuse him. I should have asked more questions before I did that. Vanessa didn't respond to her either. She just kept staring at her own hands like she was trying to find something in them that would explain how she'd gotten to this room. She didn't answer me. She just nodded, once, barely, and looked down at her hands. In the weeks between the demand letter and the family gathering at my aunt's, there was a stretch of time that felt like waiting for a verdict nobody had scheduled. Marcus told me to keep a low profile, to stop responding to anything Vanessa sent directly, and to route everything through him instead. That was harder than it sounds. She texted me twice more before her lawyer withdrew, both times late at night, both times some version of the same argument, that I'd humiliated her in front of 40 people, that I'd made myself the hero of a story where she was really just a stressed mother doing her best. I didn't respond to either message. Marcus said that was exactly right, that anything I wrote back could end up characterized as continued harassment if this actually went in front of a judge, and the last thing I needed was to hand her a single new sentence to twist. The financial strain of the whole ordeal lingered even after the lawsuit evaporated. I'd paid Marcus a $2,000 retainer just to get through the initial response letter, money I pulled from a savings account I'd been building toward a down payment on a house. It wasn't the $5,000 to $10,000 he'd originally warned me about, but it was enough to set me back the better part of a year on plans I'd been quietly making for over 2 years. I don't regret spending it. I just remember sitting at my kitchen table doing the math on a spreadsheet, watching a number I'd worked hard for shrink because my cousin had decided the truth was worth suing over, and feeling a kind of exhausted fury that had nowhere left to go. My uncle, Vanessa's father, split the family in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. He wasn't cruel about it, not exactly, but he kept circling back to the same phrase whenever the subject came up, that airing dirty laundry in front of 40 wedding guests was its own kind of wrong, regardless of what was actually true. My aunt, his wife, disagreed with him openly for what I understood was the first time in their marriage, at least in front of other people. She told him in front of me that she'd searched a 6-year-old's backpack for money her own grandson had stolen, and that she wasn't interested in relitigating who deserved dignity in that story. They didn't resolve it that day. I don't think they fully resolved it since. Holidays at their house got quieter after that, the kind of quiet where everyone is being careful. Paige, on the other hand, became someone I hadn't expected to grow close to. We'd always been friendly, cousins who liked each other well enough at family functions, but never people who called just to talk. That changed after her wedding. She called me 2 weeks later apologizing for something that wasn't even her fault, saying she felt sick that her own wedding day had become the place where all of it finally surfaced, and I told her the opposite was true, that I was grateful it happened somewhere with enough witnesses that nobody could pretend it hadn't. She sent Eli a stuffed dinosaur that Christmas with a note that just said, "You were never the problem, buddy," and she started including him in her own kids' birthday parties without me even having to ask. David filed for separation from her 4 months later, a fact I learned secondhand through my aunt rather than from either of them directly. He and I spoke once more after that, briefly, at a gas station of all places, both of us pumping gas 10 feet apart on a Saturday morning before either of us noticed the other. He told me he'd spent 2 years telling himself Vanessa's version of events because it was easier than admitting his own son needed more help than either of them wanted to face. He said watching that footage at the wedding was the first time he'd let himself see the full pattern laid out end to end, instead of one excusable incident at a time. I told him I understood that better than he probably realized, since I'd spent a year doing something similar with Vanessa herself, giving her the benefit of the doubt one incident at a time until the incidents added up to something I could no longer explain away. He asked, before we both got back in our cars, whether I thought Vanessa could ever really change. I told him I didn't know, that I hoped so for Grayson's sake, but that hope wasn't something I was willing to keep extending credit against anymore, not after everything it had already cost my son to wait and see. The demand letter, as it turned out, had never actually been filed with the court. Marcus told me these things often didn't get that far once the other side realized the evidence wasn't in their favor. Vanessa's lawyer withdrew from the case within 2 weeks of receiving our response, citing what he vaguely called insufficient grounds. Marcus billed me for 11 more hours of work before it was fully fully closed out, on top of the original retainer. Money that came out of the same savings account and pushed my house plans back even further than I'd first calculated. He waived the final 2 hours as a courtesy once the case formally closed, which he told me he rarely did, but said the therapy records and the text message had made this one of the more clear-cut files he'd seen in years. Renee stayed close through all of it in ways I don't think I properly thanked her for at the time. She picked Eli up from school twice a week for months so I could take calls with Marcus without him overhearing words like lawsuit and defamation. She sat with me on the porch more nights than I can count, listening to the same worries on repeat, never once telling me I was overreacting, never once suggesting I let it go for the sake of family peace. When people ask me now how I got through that year, I usually mention the footage and the lawyer because those are the concrete, tellable parts. What I don't always say out loud is that none of it would have held together without my sister showing up, night after night, with tea I never drank, and a legal pad full of dates neither of us wanted to be writing down. My aunt, the one who'd searched Eli's backpack in her own kitchen, sent me a long, apologetic text a month after that, admitting she'd wanted so badly to believe Vanessa had everything under control that she'd stopped asking obvious questions. Grandma started calling me every Sunday, something she'd never done before, checking in on Eli specifically, asking to speak to him on the phone, as if she were trying to make up for 2 years of apology letters with 2 years of Sunday calls. Some relatives never fully came around. My uncle kept a distance from me at the gatherings he still hosted, polite but cool, and I stopped going out of my way to attend them. There's only so much energy I have for people who think exposing the truth is worse than a year of lying to a 6-year-old's face. Grayson, for what it's worth, is doing better now. David has full custody on weekdays, and from what my aunt tells me, the therapy that started because of a kindergarten teacher's concern has continued, this time without a mother in the room insisting there was nothing wrong. The custody arrangement itself took another 6 months to settle, with its own set of mediators and filing fees and calendars split into color-coded weeks, a process David described to me once, tiredly, as feeling like a second full-time job stacked on top of raising a 7-year-old who was only just beginning to understand why his parents didn't live together anymore. Vanessa fought the custody terms harder than she'd fought the defamation case, which told me something about which battle actually mattered to her, though I try not to sit in judgment of that too long, since I don't know what it is to lose that much of your life structure at once, however much of it she'd built on something false. I don't know if Grayson understands what happened, or what role he played, or what role was forced onto him by a parent more invested in image than truth. I try to remember, even now, that he was 7 years old in the middle of all of this too, being used the same way Eli was, just from the opposite direction. When I see him now at the gatherings I still attend, he's quieter than he used to be, less quick to fill a silence with a confident answer that isn't true. I don't know if that's therapy working or just a 7-year-old growing up around consequences for the first time in his life. Either way, I find I can't hate him the way I once let myself hate the version of him I watched on that footage over and over. He was a kid being taught by the person who should have protected him most that the truth was negotiable if you said it with enough conviction. That's not a lesson a 7-year-old chooses for himself. There was a strange grief in all of it that I hadn't expected. I'd spent over a year hardening myself against Vanessa, building a case the way you'd build a legal file, and I assumed that when the truth finally came out, I would feel something like victory. Mostly what I felt, once the demand letter stopped mattering and the lawsuit quietly disappeared, was sadness. Vanessa and I had been close once, genuinely close, in a way that had nothing to do with our sons. We'd been bridesmaids in each other's weddings. She'd sat with me in a hospital waiting room the night Eli was born, holding my hand through 12 hours of labor, while my ex-husband was still in transit from a work trip. Somewhere in the last 2 years, that version of her had gotten buried under something I still don't fully understand. Some need to be seen as the perfect mother of a perfect son that outweighed everything else, including a little boy who trusted her. Eli is 8 now. He still has that blue blanket, worn thinner every year, though he mostly keeps it folded on a shelf instead of dragging it around like he used to. He doesn't ask anymore if he's a bad kid. It took months of quiet, deliberate reassurance, therapy of his own for a while, actually, before that question stopped surfacing at bedtime. His new kindergarten report cards, the ones from the year after all of this settled, describe a kid who's confident, quick to laugh, generous with other children, words that felt almost unbelievable to read the first time, considering how much of that year he'd spent believing he was the opposite of all of it. He sees Grayson occasionally now, at the handful of gatherings I've decided are safe enough to attend, and the two of them play like nothing ever happened, the way kids sometimes can when the adults around them finally stop building weapons out of their childhoods. I bought that house eventually, a smaller one than I'd originally planned, a year later than I'd budgeted for, with a fenced-in backyard in a quieter part of Marietta, where Eli has his own room for the first time in his life. He picked out the paint color himself, a pale blue he compared to his blanket, and I let him choose it even though I privately would have gone with something else, because after everything, I wanted him to have at least one space in the world where his own judgment was never going to be second-guessed. I think about that Thanksgiving a lot, the paper plate, the flattened marigolds, my son's chin shaking as 14 relatives waited for him to confess to something he never did. I think about how long I let it go on before I decided to fight, how many small incidents I absorbed and excused because I didn't want to be the difficult one, the paranoid one, the cousin who couldn't take a joke about her kid stealing 40 cents from a purse. I think, too, true about the version of me who might have skipped a year of that filming if I'd trusted my own eyes sooner, who might have said something the very first time a lamp got broken instead of waiting for the pattern to prove itself past any possible doubt. I don't know if that version of me would have been believed any faster. I only know I'd like to think she'd have tried. What I understand now, in a way I didn't back then, is that reputations built on other people's silence are the most fragile thing in the world. Vanessa's whole identity depended on nobody looking too closely, on everyone accepting her version of events because questioning it felt exhausting and unkind. All it took to burn that down was patience, and a camera, and my refusal to keep absorbing something that was never true in the first place. I still catch myself sometimes watching Eli at a family gathering, counting the room the way I used to when I was building my case. Old habits don't leave clean, but most of the time now I catch myself for a different reason, just to watch him laughing with his cousins, unguarded, without checking anyone's face first to see whether he's about to be blamed for something. That's the version of watching I'd choose every time, if I could go back and skip the year it took to earn it. I don't regret what I did. I regret that it took so long, and I regret what it cost my son to get there. Some family gatherings turned into courtrooms for him, and I let it happen for longer than I should have before I finally decided to file my own case, one piece of footage at a time, until the truth was too heavy for anyone in that room to keep looking away from.